let the record show that we have a quorum. I'd like to call the Public Accounts Committee back in.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Okay.
Mr. Scott, we want to thank you for taking time out. We know you're a busy man, and we know that your time is highly costly, but we're not going to employ you this afternoon as an auditor. We're here to ask you a few questions about your volunteerism as chairman of the Education Council. So the only rule is that when you answer the first question, just say your full name and what position you represented. That's just for the record. So thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it. And this is a very friendly committee. You know how to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and through you. And first, to the record, I just want to thank the witness also for his sterling public service. Like you say, he does get paid by the hour, but he does spend a lot of time giving back to the country, and we just want the record to recognize that we also recognize his contributions to the country. One of the things, through you, Mr. Chairman, to the witness, one of the things that we are a little bit stuck on going through the Auditor General's report is the long-term strategic plan for the ministry as a whole. Now, under the Constitution, I mean, this is the Public Accounts Committee, we can't get into the issues of policy. That is something reserved for the ministry. But unfortunately, during the last government budget, there was no debate on the throne speech, so we have no idea in terms of the direction that the minister and the ministry is going on in that regard. And when the question was posed to the chief officer earlier, she basically deflected to the minister. Now, I understand from my own research that the minister has empowered the Education Council in some regard, and I'm hoping that maybe today we can at least have some idea at a very high level in terms of where the council sees the education going, and ultimately how will that vision, because right now what we're trying to understand is a vision for education, and then ultimately the plan to support that vision. It has unfortunately just been a standard where there seems to be a lot of things going on, but we're trying to see what the big picture look like, what the vision look like in terms of where we are. In the Auditor General's report, she highlighted the fact that the cost per student in public school compared to private school was 66% higher. And also within the OECD countries, it was basically, except of 33 countries, except for one of them, Cayman was also the second highest per cost. So we don't see it as an issue of resources, but issue of more priority, vision, and everything else. So the resources are available. And that's what we're trying to determine today for this committee and also for the listening public. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dan Scott, Chairman of Education Council. And through the chair, sir, to respond. Like yourself, Education Council, and indeed I know the Minister, has asked us to consider a number of these things, and particularly our role as Education Council is to give advice as it relates to strategic matters such as that. So we're doing a number of projects, and we have a number of work streams that we've been undertaking. To share with you, one such example is around TVET, or Technical and Vocational. And that is something that we've undertaken, having engaged with the minister on it, and indeed we are looking to be able to provide recommendations from a subcommittee of council up through council and ultimately to the minister. When we've looked at this, the idea here, I think, that in consultation with the minister that we're embarking on is, as opposed to perhaps in the past where we've sat in silos and drafted a strategy, the approach that we are looking to undertake is really one that we would term demand-led. And so part of this is really going out and understanding what do we need, what are the demands, what are we looking for coming out of our children. And this, I'm just using TVET as an example, but indeed more broadly. The idea here is that we're moving from just simply putting a process in place to really trying to talk about the life cycle of a student coming through and understanding what is the end game, as opposed to simply leaving them to say, okay, well, you've graduated, then what? But really trying to produce students that there's a demand to employ them. We also are operating under the basis that when you think about Cayman, we are a knowledge-based economy. We don't manufacture anything. So it is critically important that the talent we have and our most valuable natural resource being our people, that they are able to compete on a global basis. So part of what we're working on, and I do accept and we realize that there has not been a comprehensive plan as to where we get to. Like yourself, sir, I do agree that, you know, as we sit here today, and indeed, as we've looked at it, it is not a question of this honorable House and the members voting the funds. It is figuring out how we best deliver what we need to deliver with the funds that we have. And indeed, the minister has been very supportive on this. We are working, and this is a work in progress, and I use TVET as an example. We're also looking at more broadly what it means within the schools and how we're going to deliver and how the school and improvement continues. One of the things I have been very pleased with is following the recommendations. We've seen, tremendous support from the ministry. The chief officer and her team have done an outstanding job in implementing significant change. And I think when you think about what it has taken to, in many respects, start to turn this ship, there's much work to be done. I think we'd all like to see it faster, me for one, and them as well, but they're working through it. And I am pleased, as is my council, with the way that they've managed that. For example, the change in curriculum. I think it was Mark Twain said, the only person who enjoys change is a wet baby, right? And so one understands the resistance and the challenges that they've had. But what we're hoping to do is coming out of this, and we have utilized, and I also wanted to note and thank the members of Education Council, because not only do they meet regularly, but we've established a number of work streams through subcommittees that we are working at pace, and these folks are putting in many hours for free to be able, as well, we are, with the minister's permission, we're also bringing in folks from outside, leaders in industry and otherwise, to consult, to be able to come up with what makes sense. So that together, the plan there is to bring all that together, deliver recommendations up to the minister through the ministry, and utilizing that to develop this overarching strategic plan. Because as I say to people, I'm not an educator, but I do understand process, and I understand that coming through this, we have to develop talent that we, in the business community, not only would like to employ, but we are anxious to employ. And that is the objective that we're working on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, certainly I want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues in welcoming the witness and thanking him for his time, and certainly hoping to be brief. I'm glad you raised the subject of TVET, Technical Vocational Educational Training. I am very pleased to see TVET coming together, and whilst, as the report indicates, we still have a lot of work to do, I am particularly pleased with the enthusiasm that the Education Council has embraced specific to TVET, and I want to thank you, Mr. Woody Foster, the Education Council, and the subcommittees for the work in this regard, particularly against the backdrop that we don't have a purpose-built facility, which would otherwise suggest to those in the public that we're serious about TVET. And I've always said that we can get it done using the existing mechanisms. It's the will to move forward, and you clearly understand this. My focus, I think, is twofold, partly as a member of this committee, but also in my capacity as Councillor for Employment. And that is, how can we utilize this program to get more Caymanians placed in jobs that would otherwise go to work permit holders? And in particular, what has been the reaction to the TVET program from some of the local business merchants and partners that the Education Council seeks to partner with in this endeavor? And equally as important, understanding the importance of training a local workforce so that they can compete, I think you said globally, but also locally. And of course, to minimize the need for additional work permits, is there any assistance your council might need from us as representatives in achieving your desired outcomes?
Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed. I mean, we always welcome the support, and I do want to comment on that from the standpoint of Ed Council. It has been outstanding on both sides of this honorable house, and we thank you for that. We thank you for your support. Where we're at now as we have embarked on this, the response has been tremendous, and as you referred to Mr. Foster, who's leading this subcommittee for us, and we also went out and reached out to key individuals in the private sector. These were folks who operate businesses. In particular, we looked at businesses where there were large groups of people being employed, whether it was the hospitality industry, restaurant industry, and indeed, you know, we had another area where we wanted to make sure as we get on construction and all those things. The other area that we're focused on, where we've seen a real demand, certainly when you look at the work permits, has been in the area of beauticians or nail technicians and such as that. And so we also have sitting on this committee someone who operates a very successful business that is in that space giving that advice. Because for us, our view was that those are the people who have to tell us what are they looking to employ. And you're absolutely right. And the reason why I referred that they have to compete globally is because of our work permit process, we are competing globally. And they would say, if I am looking to employ someone that is skilled in hairdressing or otherwise, there are qualifications that go with that, and that is what their customers are going to demand. So we are focused on that. The support to date has been outstanding as far as working together. Our view has been, in which we've said to them, is look, we want your engagement, but understand the end game here is not just to create another program. These are the people you will be employing, right? Because if we've done it, whether it's city and guild qualification or whatever it is, if that is ultimately agreed and supported by the minister and the government, when these are delivered to you, don't tell me that they're not qualified. So they fully understand that, and quite honestly, they've embraced it. You know, for example, again, overall in the cosmetology industry, the individual we have sitting on that subcommittee, as well as the other industries, have been nothing but supportive and excited about it, right? So, but the reality is, and we've been clear on that, this is our end game. It's not just to say a student has gone through and done a course. That course needs to lead to employment and real opportunity. So that's our objective as we go through this, and the whole life cycle of students being able to make it into the workforce and be productive.
Thank you for that response. Mr. Chairman, I have other questions not connected to TVET, and I will certainly yield to any other member if they have a question specific to TVET before I move on.
Just on the technical side, has there been any update or progress? During the last Finance Committee, we had a separate funding was brought for the Superior Order program as one of the TVET program. I know that wasn't in the initial budget, but it's something that members felt was actually needed, and I think the government had allocated $150,000 for each of the next 2 years with that. Has there been any update or progress with regards to where the Superior Auto Trading program is?
Yes, sir. Through Chair, on that, we did have our last council meeting, which was the last Thursday in January. We do them every Thursday in January. We did invited them at the request of the minister to join us, and they spoke with council. The process right now is they do need to apply to be licensed as an institution, and they're working closely with them to gather the necessary information as we do with other institutions of learning based on the law. They have to go through that process. And so what we've committed to them is get the information in, and indeed council has committed that if they need to have special meetings for this, as we do with others, to expedite it, we will. So that is in process, and just waiting for that information to be delivered up through the secretary. So.
I have a question with the TVET as it relates to the, I understand that you're taking care of the education side of it, but the licensing of plumbers and electricians specifically, I think is a big impediment on getting jobs, because we have this ridiculous thing that a plumber, although you certify him under Citizen Guilds, he has to go and work for another plumber digging trenches for 2 years. And the same thing with an electrician. When you certify somebody as an electrician, they should be, that certification should allow them to go and be employed as a wireman, for instance. You certify somebody as a plumber, they should be able to go and get a job as a journeyman plumber, not a master plumber, because that's a different certification. But I think part of the impediment, particularly for Caymanians, is that even after they get the qualifications, they are then expected to work for somebody else for 2 years, which is ridiculous. So I think it needs to see if it can influence the ministries who are doing the license to change that, so that when education gives the people, because obviously if you're doing Citizen Guilds, that is going to involve a certain amount of practical experience as part of it. So
I will take that back and take that on board, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I was not aware.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Scholarships is a complete topic, but there's young people out in the public who are out of school who are not able to afford. But is there anything going to be put in place that these people can, because as you know, I started an electrical, myself at Master Electrician Burns ranking, started an electrical school in West Bay. We're in our second year. And it's all free. We supply everything. Is there anything in the works that you could say as type of scholarship, and it could be looked at to help young Caymanians who want to, but they just can't afford to go to certain things?
Through the chair, that actually, and you're absolutely right, sir, that is one of the challenges that I think a number of people have. As we're considering this, and indeed through our scholarship subcommittee, this, and it is for young people, but indeed also for mature students, folks who are looking to, change careers or upskill. And so part of what we're working on now will also be a project to better understand what's out there. And as you referred to, is through, and I think in due course in the not too distant future, we'll make some recommendations around potential scholarships in those spaces, understanding that the current criteria for academic scholarship is not fit for purpose for this. So that is indeed one of the things that, council and are looking at, and indeed through a subcommittee of scholarship subcommittee, which again is extremely busy one, but they've been doing outstanding work.
Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for the member raising scholarships as certainly my second question. I wonder if the witness can expand a little on how the Education Council is using the merit versus means testing method in the consideration of scholarship applications. Are these tests mutually exclusive, or are both factors being considered when, to my colleague's point, you decide on who would otherwise get and who would not be approved? And the reason I ask this question, Mr. Chairman, through you, is whilst the objective, as I understand it, is certainly to assist young Caymanians, young talented Caymanians who would not otherwise have the means to access tertiary education. I think along the lines of our previous conversation on TVET, we also must be cognizant of fortifying our main industries with the right local talent to ensure that Caymanians aren't just placed with employment, but more importantly, have an opportunity to start developing careers. And as we all agree, those careers begin with education. So certainly, merits versus means testing, are they mutually exclusive, or are they both considered factors when considering scholarship applications?
Through the chair. Thank you, sir. The answer is when we look at it and the scholarship programs as it is now, there are academic criteria which have been established. And those criteria we look at across all the academic scholarships. So it is a merit based from that standpoint. We also, as we considered it and indeed made recommendations up through to the minister, which were approved, that we did need to implement, in our view, a means test. And the reason for that, quite honestly, is that while I think the government and everyone in this Honourable House every year supports scholarship, there's still a limited amount. And so for council, as you go down the list, reality is how do you prioritize who should be granted this? If there's loads left over, everybody can get it. But if not, the reality is that Dan Scott's kids will go to school because, frankly, he can afford it. The difference is that what we were concerned about was if someone had, so use my kids for example, they're going to the best schools, they're going to be guaranteed the best support, get the best tutors. Now compare them to a child coming from a family of modest means, folks with minimum wages. And if all we're doing is establishing a criteria on basis of academics, my kids should be able to have all the tools to do better. So if they're scoring a 3.75, 3.8, 4.0, and there are other students, because of demand versus supply, that are getting the 3.5s, and we're strictly grading it based on academics, my kids get a scholarship, and there's some other child who has no other means to get that scholarship, and quite honestly, what it becomes is the worst form of regressive taxation possible. Because I go to the store, or my family does, and buy the same groceries that this family has to, right? And that money is gathered in through import duties, which ultimately, if they're then turning around, giving it back to me, and quite honestly, I can afford, and part of this is coming from the background we did and having grown up, I've been blessed and very fortunate to have the opportunities that I've had, and it's for me to say now that I should just continue to do that and ignore everybody else. That again is a bit of the overarching policy we put in place and why the means test has been adopted to make sure clearly if there is excessive, then it goes down, and if one of my kids were to have applied, they'd be considered. They haven't applied, and I don't think they will, but I'll ensure. But that is the context. So it is really academics, but it's not strictly academic. You have to balance that with the means.
In terms of resources, there are some of us who believe that there's a whole pile of money languishing out there in the private sector through business staffing plans, to which Caymanians who need scholarships are being denied access because nobody seems to be monitoring it. In your restructuring of the whole scholarship secretariat, is there a consideration being given to change that requirement under the business staffing plan of just saying, I'm going to give a scholarship, to say, listen, you will write a check the 1st of January for 10 people at $20,000 a person, and the education secretariat would be the persons who allocate the scholarship. Because I know of instances where people have gone to business in the private sector, and they know are supposed to provide X number of scholarships based on a number of work permits, and there's some formula that's used in business staffing plan. But there's nobody in immigration department can tell you whether the scholarships that are granted, and the people are just saying they don't exist.
We would actually welcome the opportunity to, if there was scholarships money out there, and I think it would be certainly, I think we would welcome the opportunity to assist with that. Any additional funding would be great. The other side of that, which as I wear my hat as my firm and the way we operate, is we would not want to hand our scholarships over because we do spend them, and we view the granting of scholarship is investing in talent, and we jealously guard our talent and we fight hard for it. So we use that because we view them not simply as ticking a box, pass the test, but quite the contrary. We're going to go out there, we're looking for this talent, we're growing it. They are the next generation, because it is, for business, when we make those investments, it is what we need. It's no different than people buying bricks and mortar if that's their business. Our business is about talent and about people. So if folks have additional that they're not spending, that would be tremendous.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, that actually now scares me, because this House did pass a motion unanimously that for all of those companies that had the business staffing plan requirement for scholarships that wasn't paying or doing anything, that they were supposed to go and create an education fund for those monies to be passed into. And it was a motion that I brought that the government accepted, and it's clearly now, it appears that nothing has been done in that for almost like 2 years now. And again, this is money that we could have collected over the past 2 years, or at least 1 year, in terms of implementation, but this is a basic requirement. And this came out when I sat as a member of the Business Staffing Plan Board, and we saw many of these companies who had these scholarship, and that's when we realized that a lot of them wasn't being used. So they've made a commitment to educate Caymanians. They're not keeping that commitment based on getting the business staffing plan approved. And now, all of a sudden, now, they have basically been getting away with murder now for the last 10, 15 years. And that's a lot of money we're talking about. So I would appreciate if the witness can at least follow back up within the ministry to see where they are in terms of that implementation. But that was something that was approved unanimously in this honorable House already. Thank you.
And when you try to FOI from immigration, how many scholarships are out there? Nobody knows, right? But, and I would ask you to consider one other criteria, because one of the problems we have is when Caymanians come back having completed their education, they can't get in a job. So if Company A offers a scholarship to John Brown as part of their legal requirement to the government, I would like to see a stipulation put on that they have to employ the person for at least 3 years, pending that the person, at least give them the opportunity. If the person goes in and he messes up, and I don't know, you get no sympathy from me, but we need to provide somehow to ensure that these Caymanians get their foot in the door, and it's up to them then to prove themselves. So if we could at least get the scholarship secretariat to put that rider on the scholarships that the private sector is issuing to Caymanians, that if you give a person a scholarship, the person completes the scholarship up to your grade level, you are duty bound to employ them for a specific period of time to get them over that hump where they become marketable because they now have 3 to 5 years experience.
And Mr. Chair, as it currently sits, Ed Council doesn't have the oversight of any private sector scholarship, but frankly, sir, I don't disagree with you. I can tell you with our firm, when we are giving someone a scholarship, not only are they getting a scholarship, it's guaranteed they're getting internships. as I said, we jealously guard them. They're back here for summers, we have them, and these young people are guaranteed when they graduate, they have a job. They're going to be working with us, and I struggle to understand why other organizations, that's not that important to them, because we're investing, not only are we investing in the scholarship, we're investing in the mentoring, the growth, the guidance, because frankly, it's the reason why I sit where I sit today is because someone did it for me.
Yeah, unfortunately, Mr. Scott, I think that your firm, and to a large extent, the accounting firms are exceptions to the rule. Because quite frankly, they would save if they're not paying pension and health insurance because they've employed somebody else on a work permit, and not doing that would pay the scholarship back in 3 or 4 years. So we agree, and I know from information that others have, but that your firm, I know, is doing a fantastic job in it, but unfortunately, we would like to say that that was the standard, but that's not the standard by far.
Sure. And sorry, if there's anything that we can do in engaging, and if given the mandate to help support that, we certainly would welcome it, because I do have a very committed group on Ed Council who are, understand the critical importance of this, educating our people.
The immediate question that comes to mind is there active consideration of raising the sum from the 20,000 ceiling up to something that is more appropriate today, like 50?
There is. It's one of the things that the minister has tasked us with, and there is recommendations which will be going to the minister probably as soon as this afternoon. So she has raised that with us already. You're right, sir, as time has gone on, and she has noted that this has been for a while, and it is in many cases simply not enough to cover students. And I think the unfortunate thing there is some students with the best will in the world don't have additional means, so they're losing opportunities, and that's one that the minister has been very focused on, and council has reviewed it and have what we think is appropriate recommendations going forward.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Scott, as part of the council's remit in terms of making decision, do they get a list of the number of work permits and the categories of work permits? And the reason why I'm asking this is just looking at page 99 of the Company of Statistics and just looking at the breakdown of some of the different jobs that we had. I couldn't help but notice under the section professionals, technicians, and associate professionals, at the end of 2018, there were 14,144 positions, and 51% of those were Caymanian, which is 7,234. But remaining 6,910, 49% was actually non-Caymanians. And ultimately, I do recognize that those are the jobs that we'd want our people in terms of pushing towards. And also, even in the skilled agriculture and fisheries, again, it is predominantly non-Caymanian in that area, and also within the service and sales workers. And the reason why I raise this issue is that one of the things that has been, in my opinion, a disconnect between what kids are sometimes going off to schools to study versus what the market actually calls for. And I think that's one of the things that ultimately for the government, where that investment, because for the government, it's not an expense, it's actually an investment in future productivity of the country. And now we see some kids coming back from schools with some degrees, and sometimes I have to ask, now, where were you planning on working with that degree when you return home? So I'm just curious to ask if there is a list of that and if that goes into consideration. I know they used to do it yesterday has gone by. That's how I ended up being an accountant versus wanting to fly planes. Because they're like, this is what you're going to do. If you want to do that, we're not giving you no money for that. So I just want to understand if that is something that's being done now.
Through the chair, yes, sir, it's actually one of the other things that the minister's asked us to look at. We've also had conversations with Ms. Macfield-Nixon to understand, because again, as we look at this, we want to make sure that what is happening on scholarships is also prioritized. We do not have the data as yet, but it is one that I can assure you that subcommittee and indeed the scholarship secretariat is going to be very focused on probably not for this round of scholarships, but by the time we hit the next round later in the year, because we're going to work to say, okay, what's already out there, what's the demand, and prioritize it on that basis. And because you're absolutely right, sir. When you look at it, we're trying to fill the jobs that exist, right? They're jobs that are here. What do we shouldn't be chasing something imaginary. So, but it's again gathering the data, and there are also efforts ongoing to be able to have better data on scholarships, including what happens, and you would have seen from the Auditor General's report, what happens in the aftermath of someone, when you finish school, do you get a job? What's happening there, and to be able to track these students. So our undertaking is, and as we've asked, is that there needs to be time, effort, but also systems put in place to be able to gather this data, which better informs the decision that we're making. But that is one that later on in the year we expect to be in a much better position to be able to say these are priorities. Ultimately, it's for the government to say, yeah, we're good with that, but it would be those recommendations coming forward.
May I make a suggestion also? There used to be a salary survey that was conducted by the Chamber of Commerce, was quite extensive. They had stopped it after the 2006, and to Ewan Marksom's credit, when he was president, they brought it back in 2016, which was exactly a 10-year gap. And I actually did an analysis between the salaries between 2006 and 2016, the 10-year gap. And I was quite surprised because it surveys both employers and employees. So employers say they're paying this, but employees says they're receiving that. So you kind of get an idea in terms of what the true salary was. And I was a little bit shocked as some of the jobs that we thought was actually low paying was actually much higher than expected. I think I can probably find that spreadsheet and probably email it to you. But it would be good to also take a look at that. So at least when you're saying to students, wait a minute, these jobs, you look at the mechanics, you look at the plumbers and so forth. I mean, these guys are making money hand over fist, especially in a strong development economy. But for whatever reason, people have this view that some of these jobs don't pay. And I think that's some of the misconception that we need to put out there so people can understand that, these things, there is money in it. So I will email it to you so you can have it.
That would be great, and I do agree with you. I think one of the misunderstandings, and quite honestly, we've created it in the environment and the things that we've done, even when we look at the physical plant that we have these students work in compared to those who we say are more academic. But the reality for this, and I look in my own family with my siblings and whatnot, we've chosen to go different ways, but when you look at the businesses that, for example, I look at my brother runs, they can do very, very well, right? And I look in my case, if you ask me to fix an engine, you're going to walk because I don't know how to do it. But I always admire, and the reality for those, if folks get it, and there are examples of people who are out there, they do it well. It is in high demand. They get to be entrepreneurs, build businesses that become generational. They pass it down. Again, I look at my brother. I mean, his son is now in the business with him, and that becomes the dream because as entrepreneurs, business owners, small businesses ultimately make up the background, and folks with the skills in technical and vocational. There's so many examples in other countries and then some here, but it is for us as well to make sure that it is clear when our children or young people choose to do those things, they can do extremely well. And frankly, in many cases, do much better than people who choose to do accounting, right?
Mr. Chairman, through you, before I change gears a little bit, I want to respond to a remark made by Mr. Saunders on the subject of priorities. The reason why his father, the wise man that he was, said to him, go get your accounting degree first, was so that if he wanted to, afterwards he can learn how to fly, as others have in your profession. So your father clearly understood priorities.
Actually, just to set the record straight, his view was, when that engine cut off up there, them wings don't flap. That was his views.
Just a little bit of levity, Mr. Chairman. I want to change gears a little bit and turn my attention to a subject that rarely gets discussed at this level, but by no means is any less important in the overall education continuum. And certainly to the Office of the Auditor General's credit, they didn't allow it to escape their focus, and in particular, recommendation number 18, found on page 56 of your report, notes that there is no national strategy for special education needs in the Cayman Islands. According to the report, students with special education needs, or SEN, attend either mainstream public school or the Lighthouse School. Statistics show that the number of students with special education needs in mainstream public schools has increased by 24% from 396 in 2013 to 493 in 2017. I wonder if you can clarify something for me, though. The report states the majority, which tends to suggest not all, the majority attend either mainstream public school or the Lighthouse School. I have received representation from my own constituents who are parents of special education needs children, who perhaps as a primary education, they're either in public school or the Lighthouse. But also, as we see across the community, many parents choose to supplement that public education for their special education needs children through one of the various special education or tutoring centers specifically for children with special needs. My question is, how does the Education Council assess these smaller, usually privately owned special education centers to ensure that the curriculum in which they are passing on or using to teach our children is suitable for our children, specifically those with special education needs?
Thank you, sir. Through the chair. The whole topic of special education, and you can see from the statistics, has been one that there's been a huge growth in the numbers, and the numbers identified as special education. The challenge that brings with it is that as we're looking at it, and one has to ask what is driving these statistics? Was it because there's now more informed parents, more informed students? Is it, in some cases, misdiagnosis because the child is acting up and teachers want them to go a different route and not disturb a classroom? Any number of things that I think everybody's wrestling with trying to get their arms around. One of the things, however, that is noteworthy is that in order to try and achieve this and provide support, I think everybody goes, and as we have been as council, and said, how do we best support it? And through the experts within the ministry and the folks that have been appointed, the councillors and otherwise, we look for them to give advice on where they think these students are best placed. And indeed, even as we're going through to license particular centers of tutoring or otherwise, the criteria around the qualifications of the teachers and whatnot, all that is scrutinized as we look to do it. What I would say to you is there's much work to be done around that. I had the opportunity to join the minister and her team on a trip to the UK where we visited schools, and it's also noteworthy, my firm paid for me to go, so just that's part of the record. And I had the opportunity to join them and visit some of the schools in the UK. And it was interesting because even as we look at student to teacher ratios and whatnot, these were large classrooms. But what there was telling for me as it relates to this specific point was that the teachers themselves in the classroom, SEN students were not excluded. Even those who had some of the more noticeable and extreme cases, they were meant to be part of the mainstream, and those teachers were skilled with how to deal with that. And so it's an interesting transition as to where we ultimately go with it, but it is that sort of stuff, and I know it's one that the ministry has been working on, and indeed even as they've implemented new curriculum, they've moved things like counselors out of sitting at DES back into the school. So much work to be done on it, but all those things continue to, I think, work together. And an overall SEN policy is one that we clearly need to have input, work on, and develop for the country at large, because there are more and more students, and not only coming out of the public schools, but we're going to gather data, I will also tell you, coming out of private schools as well. One of the other aspects to this, which I'll put out there, is the whole concept of kids with special SEN kids. In some cases, it is as simple as kids who are finding themselves in an environment that they're being bullied, right? And they simply are not able to manage that. That's another issue that I do think needs to be dealt with.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I'm just a bit curious because, and I guess in my background, I've been taught to approach so many stuff with professional skepticism. And I've always had my concerns with this SEN issue. And part of it is driven by, I know of a couple of cases where within the public schools, kids were diagnosed as SEN children. The parents refused to accept it. And then the kids went to the private schools, didn't say anything to them, and doing extremely well. And I've seen like this when they had Y2K going around, where people have gone out and created a cottage industry from Y2K. I've seen it now in the compliance industry, where they have gone out now and created another cottage industry within the industry, where more money is spent on compliance now than even business development. And I'm wondering now, and like I said, this was my personal opinion, what is the, I guess, assessments done or to determine, or what are the factors to determine a SEN student? Because I've seen some kids where they have just said that, you know, the issue was this, but it just turns out the child was just bored. The child was just ahead of something else. And I understand when people are, you know, SEN qualified, and in some cases they need to justify all of this, but I've always been a little bit weary when there are just behavioral issues, when a child just bad. I mean, you look at Einstein, the first day he went to school, the teacher said he should be driving a short yellow bus. And look at who he turned out to be. You know, so I've always been weary about this. And the thing about it is, that the backdrop for me is, when I think there was a survey that was done where they looked at children up to, I think, year 5, year 6, most of them were like borderline genius, like 80% of them. And then they evaluated these people again like 4 or 5 years later at the end of the primary term. And it showed that the actual school system, to some extent, dulled some of their creativity, some of their geniuses and everything else. So I've always been a little bit curious in terms of what assessments, what thing is being done to say this child have a special needs, as opposed to the child that's bad or the child that's bored.
Through the chair, you're absolutely right, sir. And it's one of the things that, on balance, that I think there's now more rigor being added around this. Clearly, one wants to make sure that you do not dismiss someone who truly needs it. And that is the very careful balance. But I will tell you, and certainly with the chief officer and some of the policies that they're rolling out, there is indeed more rigor. When these requests come for special funding to Ed Council, and there is a lot more rigor. We're continuing to add around it and ask questions, bring the experts in, challenge it. I share your views. Part of it is when you get back to, what is the difference? What are we able to do within the classroom? And I think as that comes back, and you would have seen from the report and indeed the inspections, that there's work to be done around getting teachers to the level they need to be to deliver. And some of that is delivering for these kids. I always say to people, if during the time when they didn't have those labels back then, but in school you talk ADD, you don't find more ADD than me. Right? I can't walk and chew gum, but somehow it's managed to get you through, and we all have things that we're good at and not. But exactly. Absolutely. But the reality is where are we today? Is that, so there is more rigor around it, because we want to make sure, again, with the limited resources, that it is being appropriately used for those who do need it, because there clearly are some children who absolutely need it. But you're right, and I can assure you there is rigor being added both in the ministry, through DES, and within the school, and certainly at Ed Council.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, certainly I want to thank the witness again for those answers. I don't have a question, just really a comment, acknowledging that this committee usually focuses its energy scrutinizing government accounts and public accounts. That means addressing areas that are missing. But I also believe that this discussion specific to special education needs, to borrow a word from the witness, there is a silver lining or some positive news that is worth mentioning directly from the Auditor General's report. And interestingly enough, directly above where the Auditor General begins the discussion, that there is no national strategy for special education, as there is no national strategy for the broader education. They also, forgive me, went on to highlight, I think, the positive interventions that have happened specifically in special education needs over a 5-year period, 2013-2017, and to borrow a word from the witness, certainly we can see where more rigor has been applied to special education needs. And just as a member of the government, I just felt it was important to note for the record that students in special education needs, as according to paragraph 137, found on page 50 of the report, students with special education needs are identified much earlier than previously. The early intervention program covers children at pre-compulsory school age, leading to earlier identification and intervention of special education needs students. Staff in schools have had a special education needs specific professional development program in place. There's greater public awareness of special education, and I think most of all, parents are more proactive in seeking educational assessment and evaluations in order to receive formal diagnosis early for their children. And also, of course, they have access to scholarships to attend private schools or schools overseas where appropriate. So whilst in all of these areas of education we acknowledge that there's a great deal of work to be done, I also believe it is appropriate to acknowledge that they've also achieved a great deal in a short window of time. We will eventually get there to please the Public Accounts Committee, but in the meantime, I want to thank the member as chair of the Education Council, the minister, and the Ministry of Education for working towards getting it right more often than hopefully they get it wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Seeing that your background is accounting, and knowing what I know about you, everyone around you, you've always held accountable. Your staff, your family, your friends, I know that about you. I will be honest and say I didn't really think about it until I went to my granddaughter's school. And there's a camera in every classroom. The parent is actually given a code. You can jump in during the day and look at your child in the class. Now, during Finance Committee, I asked the question, and it was kind of rushed over. I asked it again today, and since then, I have surveyed 16 teachers, 4 different schools. 12 of the teachers are good teachers, and it's surprising all 12 of them said yes. They would like cameras in their classrooms. The 4 that no, after doing my homework, I found that the record wasn't that good. But my thing to the chief officer and before was 3 things. Number 1, protection of the child. Number 2, protection of the teacher. Some of the teachers have said that the last education law that came in is not really too much in favor of teachers. That's their opinion. And my thing was watching someone who goes into the schools almost every day I've seen when inspectors come around, how certain teachers step their game up to try to impress someone just for that day. Other days leave a lot to be desired. I asked them, they say they're going to undertaking to have the survey or whatever done. Can I say to you as the chairman of the council to look into this and to see, maybe do enough research that it would be a good thing for our classrooms in many, many ways. You go through your records, a teacher does a good lesson plan. But we have an example. We can show the teachers, look at what was done. I'm not so sure you want to show a bad one, but then in the dismissal of bad teachers, we could say, here, we have the evidence. This is why your class, because some teachers will say, oh, I got the worst class. Because when we went to school, you know, it was top set, second set, third set. The chairman asked them about the report cards, which has become a puzzle unto itself. Not A, B, C, D, E, F. Effort, behavior, and your grade. We all went through it. We turned out reasonable. Well, you all turned out pretty good. I leave a lot to be desired, but things have gotten really complicated. But if you have it in front of you and all these things, I can only see being a tool to help improve what we have to improve, because there's no doubt in anyone's mind that everything has moved along and left us behind. What's your opinion, and where do you think this can be done quickly?
So, through the chair, and thank you, sir, for the question. I'm of the view that transparency is good. It's the world we live in. It's what we talk about, everything that we do. And in particular, I think it brings with it the confidence to the public, to parents, and otherwise. So with that as the headline, I do think it is one of the things that when we talk about, and indeed the Auditor General's report pointed to it, is parental engagement. And I sort of pull this under that more broadly. And indeed, sir, I will take this back, and this in particular as a note to consideration as council for us to talk about it. But I think it falls under that broad approach of what does that mean, because as we go through these discussions, there's a question of privacy, right to privacy, not only for teacher, but for student and otherwise. But I think more and more we are seeing, if you talk about cameras, everywhere you walk today, there's a Ring camera, so you are on camera. And indeed, for, as you've noted, I mean, whether it's law enforcement, you see it all the time, that are wearing body cams, not only protecting, potentially the person they're dealing with, but also protecting themselves to show what behavior they exhibited. So for me, I personally haven't thought about it, but certainly as a parent, and I mean, I can tell you as a parent, when our kids were small and we had nannies at home, we put cameras in. We told them it was there, right? But we did have cameras, so you could check in on what was happening, or it got recorded. So I do think, I mean, it certainly is something that should be considered. And in particular, I think, as you said, I think private schools, certainly some of those are doing it. So.
Thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the Chairman of the Ed Council, one of the things that had kind of puzzled me a little bit, and maybe this is more something for your council to consider. Looking at the government statistics with regards to government schools, when I totaled the number of kids in private and secondary schools back in 2012, just looking at the compendium of statistics, there's a total of 4,956 children. And by the end of 2018, the number had reduced to 4,623. A decrease of 333 kids, or 7%. But one of the things that jumped out to me is on the same report, when I look at kids, when it did the 2010 census, and I look at the kids from 0 to 14, there, back in 2010, the census had 8,599, and by the end of, when it did the census back in 2010, there was a total of 7,671 children on island, Caymanian children, I should say, at the end of the 2010, and by the end of 2018, the number had increased to 8,599, roughly 928 children by 11%. I'm trying to understand why is it that despite the kids in those age group bracket, which would technically still be in school between the census in 2010 and 2018, going up by 928, but then the enrollment within the public schools by the end of 2018 had actually dropped by 7%. But I couldn't help but notice that during the same period of time, enrollment in the private sector schools moved from 2,787 in 2012 to 3,618, an increase of roughly basically 30%. So we're seeing where, despite the age group of Caymanian kids increasing, we realize now that the actual population within the schools are decreasing, but the private sector schools are increasing. And I couldn't help but wonder, and forgive me, I'm part of the blame too, because my kids attend private schools, and I've held the belief that if you can afford to put your kids someplace, why put strain on the resources of the country? But I'm curious in terms of, are these analysis that you guys looking at in terms of planning schools? Because I held the view before when I looked at the number of people with permanent residences whose children are forced to go to private schools as their PR holders. In the next 5 years or so, when the PR holders become status holders, and the kids are then entitled to go into public schools in terms of the government long-term planning. But looking at these numbers, it appears as if though the trend is going the other way. So I was worried about school population and everything else. And then also when you look in the same report and you see the amount of children at certain age group that are pretty much coming behind them, we realize that that fertility rate problem that we have is actually coming to roost because there's not enough children coming behind to replace the children that are actually there. So in other words, we're not making enough Caymanian kids to maintain the infrastructure that we have. So in terms of the long-term planning and everything else, is there something that you guys are looking at or considering as you're planning future schools and everything else? Because a school may be full today, but based on demographics and demographic shifts, some schools may become emptier. In some areas, it depends on where people are moving to or moving from, or vice versa. So I don't know if these are the kind of analysis that you guys are looking at, or in terms, but at least something to consider as you're putting together the long-term strategic plan for the country.
That's through the chair. Thank you, sir. And as you know, with your training, you know numbers, and that's where we come to. So, but you're absolutely right. You've seen the drop, and you've seen the drop in Caymanian children with the demand for government school. I can only suspect a big part of the driver there were parents choosing because they took a view that they weren't getting the level of education that they needed to in the government school. One of the things that we're undertaking is to change that, and that's been one of the things that the minister's been clear on. We have to create an environment in schools that are the most competitive, not only just within the Cayman Islands, within the region, but internationally, the quality. So that's the goal, I think, that we have as Ed Council, and it's been embarked upon. One is we've looked to ensure now that you have an independent inspection of schools, both public and private, so that it is out there and it is transparent. So parents, as the buyers, get to see what's good. Second part of that has been the change in the movement with curriculum and providing the resources that people need to be able to teach the kids, that the teachers have. The other thing I think the minister has done is talking about the compensation changes, and there's been debate around that, but now one can't question whether you can indeed attract the best talent globally, because you certainly can pay for it. So all those things I think come together to make sure that public schools have to be able to be good at what they do, be extremely competitive, and deliver outstanding product. Now, the other question that you talked about was the idea of public and private schools and folks growing up differently. When I came up through the government school system, we all went to one school. And the truth is that is the best way for us to operate as a country. The challenge clearly that we had, which I understand, was it wasn't out of trying to segregate, but more out of we only have a certain amount of physical space and budget to educate, so you prioritize Caymanians, which I think is absolutely right. And, other folks had to go to the private school. What it has meant is that young people in different schools are not getting to work together, learn about each other, break down those barriers that are otherwise created because we simply don't know each other. And I long for a time that we can get back to that. And one of the things that we will be talking about is whether there are projects that we can do which allows for more of that, whether it's, private sector building schools and government saying we will give coupons for kids to go to these schools or guarantee a certain amount, or indeed that you can do so the other way with the government school. But I think the starting point we had to first of all focus to make sure our government schools are delivering high quality education. But I am keen, and I think most people are, to see that we are now, as the future goes and as we are going to continue to grow and our population is growing quite rapidly, it is important that you put kids together, that they learn about each other. And, we are working on ideas for that, early stages. And to your question, as far as the growth, I think that's the other point, because it simply can't be limited to one or the other. The demographics, as it continues to change, even district by district. So that is a project, and I think all those things do have to be considered.
One of the things I would, thank you very much for that, Mr. Scott. I'm glad to hear you guys are looking at that. One of the things I would also suggest is to take a look at the gatekeeper within the HR system. And the reason why I say that is I've known of instances where people were dismissed from the private schools for non-performance, contracts not renewed or the usual whatever, and then they just appear in the public system. And I'm like, if you weren't good over here for these kids, what did you say or what did you do or what words did you construct in an interview to get a job within the public system? If you're a failure here, you're a failure there. You know what I mean? And I sometimes sit back and it boggles my mind how some of the people that we end up with, and in some cases, some of the HR decisions that are made with regards to teachers and principals and how it is done, it begs a lot of questions. And I would really implore you guys to seriously take a look at that.
To reinforce what Mr. Saunders just said and tie it in with something that Mr. Harris said, there was a case of one of our schools up in that side of the island, said a little boy was autistic. They sent the child to another school, ended up with this particular teacher. Now, I'm getting the story from the mother and the father. The father has a pretty high-ranking job in government. The mother has a good job in the financial industry, so they're people that know what's happening. The father has promised that teacher that the first paycheck that his child brings home, she will get. Because he said his child is not autistic. The child graduated valedictorian a year later from the class, said the speech and everything at the graduation. That teacher applied to our system and could not even be considered. Yet, I see on an everyday basis teachers that are in our system that are not as good as the lady. Something has to be looked into the HR. We don't know what it is. The same instance that, once again, the member from Bordentown West spoke about, I know of it because I know one of the parents who was on the board that dismissed the individual. They also asked me about it. And this is not the only case. But like I always say, where you come from helps a lot in getting a job in this government.
So, through the chair, I mean, as I'm sure members appreciate the role of council, we don't deal directly with HR matters, but we do have conversations and engage and make recommendations that are at a strategic level more broadly. And one of the things that I would say is that, as we all, I think it's fairly clear, the most impactful part of an education is a teacher. I can think back to the people who taught me and remember those teachers who cared, and quite honestly, we would say and we would recommend and strategic that that's where we have to put systems in place to reward those folks, and indeed for the other ones. And I think we're starting to see that with the performance management and whatnot. There's a ways to go, but we must aspire to get the very best teachers. I also have seen it up close and personal with my father, who was an educator, and many nights at our dining room table with the students, he would bring in and said, you got to do more, you got to do better, and let me help you. So there's absolutely no question that a teacher is, there's a quote which says, the best thing about being a teacher is that it matters. But the hardest thing about being a teacher is that it matters every day. And I think those are the teachers we need to look for.
Just want to close off on one issue, Mr. Scott, and through you, Mr. Chairman, to the witness. This morning I was trying to get an answer to a question which I was unable to get, other than that the chief officer will go to the minister about it. But it was coming from the Office of Education Standards Annual Report 2019, where every school a good school report, and of the 25 schools that were the performance was evaluated, only 1 of 25 was rated excellent, 5 of 25 were rated good, 12 of 25, just under half of them were satisfactory, and 7 of 25 were rated weak. And one of the things is that when we looked at the follow-through inspections that came out as a result of these of the report, we know that some of the schools that were still weak, the progress itself was still rated as being weak. So I'm glad to see at least that this is being done. But one of the things that we wanted was pretty much a timeline in terms of when we could probably expect to start seeing this turn in the different route. I mean, as the Auditor General identified and you yourself recognize, is that we do spend a lot of money in terms of cost per student in the public school versus the private sector, and also compared to other developing countries. So what we're looking for, and this is the ultimate purpose of this committee, is to find the value for money. And based on the reports from this result, we can't have a public school system that is 66% higher than the private school system and rank probably number 2 in terms of cost per student compared to developed countries and have these kind of results. So ultimately, we believe that this is something that requires an urgent need, and I'm happy the minister appointed someone of yourself, and especially your background considering who your father was and what it is that you have done yourself. So we just want to at least put that there for the council to put out there and think there, see what we can do to move this forward. Because this is one issue that is about the future of the Cayman Islands, and we're all concerned about it. Thanks.
Through the chair, that is one of the items that council and indeed the ministry is working on to determine what are the consequence management for these things to ensure change is taking place. And there's that is now again a work stream that is happening within the ministry that we have asked for and we're seeing, and indeed we've seen a first cut of it and had some comments, because part of this is both within government schools as well as private schools, you cannot, and let me underscore, we cannot continue to have weak schools and weak performances, right? There has to be consequences and changes to that. So, and it is one that is of an urgent nature. The good thing we have now is we do have, I think, a robust inspection system that is led, and and it is transparent, it is published. Early on, I got asked by someone in the private schools, and they said, well, we're concerned about our results being published. And I said, why is that? And they said, well, parents may decide that, you know, if we get a bad result, they don't want to send their kids there. And I said to them, and your point is what? Right? That's the objective, is to put control back in the hands of parents to make decisions. And ultimately, there are other things that the minister's asked us to look at, that council is considering and in short order will be making recommendations on to try and achieve a similar thing within the public school system. More governance, and you would have seen, comments around that, boards and stuff, to make sure that we're doing that and there's more control at the school level, because that's where the rubber hits the road, is that teacher in the classroom delivering for the child.
Another question?
Just one last point, just to close off with. One of the things I've noticed throughout my travel throughout the Caribbean, and particularly Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, one of the things that many of their leaders have came back with over the years, looking at their country post-independence, and they have created one theme in common, that despite all the money spent on primary education, secondary education, and tertiary education, they wish, looking back through the lens of time, that they had invested more money in basic education the first 7 years of a child's life. They figured that's where they fell down the most. And I'm glad to see where the government had brought back in reception classes and everything else to start the early the childhood. But I would just encourage that as we're looking through and creating this long-term strategic plan, is to take a look at that reception, basic education, where that foundation for that child is the first 7 years. As old people say, you bend the tree when it's young, to make sure we not even foundation, but groundation to some extent, we firmly have them planted there. And that has basically been one of the biggest difference, according to many of them, where they wish they had put more emphasis on. But, time, of course, answers every question. But I just want to say thanks, Mr. Scott, and, keep doing up the good work. And I hope your presence here serves as an example to many people that you can do well and give back to the community free of cost. So, thanks much.
Thank you, sir. That's very kind. And just, if I may, one more thing, Mr. Chair. I also want to thank the Auditor General and her team. I think it was a good report, a comprehensive report. And as I say to people, sometimes I go to do my physicals when I'm in the worst shape. But we know where we need to be going, but they did a great job, and I thank them for that.
Well, we certainly want to thank you for the job that you're doing and the time that you're giving up, and we're so concerned about that we can actually give you back 35 minutes out of what we had asked for. But please convey to the whole Education Council our gratitude and appreciation for the hard work that's being put in. We really appreciate the effort that's being made. Thank you very much for it.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chair, thank you.
The meeting is adjourned. Sign it, Dale.